And we're going to get right into it. So biology is the study of life. And biology is this big science that has many subspecialties. And anatomy and physiology are subspecialties of biology. Anatomy is the science that studies structure. So anatomy studies structure. And we can look at anatomy and we can study it in different ways. We can study gross anatomy, which is everything that we can see with our eyes. Or we can look at microanatomy, which requires a microscope. We're going to be looking at both throughout this course. We'll look at large structures that are visible with the unaided eye, and we'll be looking starting today in lab. We'll use microscopes, and this is going to take us into the cellular level so we can look at tissues in detail. The other subdivision of anatomy is developmental anatomy. We won't really talk about development, but this just looks at the ways that structures develop over time in an organism. We're not going to have time for that in this class, but you can look at like embryology and how structures are developing in utero. And then you can look at after birth, how do all of our structures grow and change. So when studying anatomy, we can use observation, we can use manipulation, you can use palpation, which is feeling. So in order to study anatomy, the tools that we have are observation, manipulation, palpation. We can also look at physiology. Physiology studies function. So it looks at these anatomical structures and says, how do these things function? And physiology is generally broken up into subdivisions based on systems. So if you're studying the kidneys and the way they function, you're studying nephrology or cardiology. So this is, the subdivisions are based on systems. And to study physiology, you have to be able to understand many different levels of organization. We have to be able to understand different physical principles and how they work together. We're going to talk about, when we get to the nervous system, the movement of ions, down concentration gradients, and things like that. So you have to be able to study a lot of different things to study physiology. We're going to study different types of sciences, so we can say different physical phenomenon. We have to study chemistry, and we have to be able to take many different sciences and kind of bring them together in our understanding in a cohesive way. So you've got to be able to understand organization. And so physiology tends to be more complex than just anatomy. But anatomy, I mean, you could try and just say, oh, I'm a nephrologist, I'm a physiologist, but without looking at the structures, you can't understand the physiology. So anatomy and physiology are very complementary sciences. They work together so that we can understand how the structures are giving rise to the function. And that's one of the things that's coolest about the body, is if you understand the anatomy and you look at the anatomy and look at the structures, it leads to the physiology. All of the structures fit like a puzzle, and the pieces just click and give rise to these complex physiological systems that allow you to be walking around and living and breathing and thinking and doing all of this stuff that you don't even have to think about. And it's because of the way that the structures work to give rise to the system, so the two sciences are really intertwined. It's hard to separate anatomy from physiology and just study one or the other. It's best to look at them together integratively because structure is always leading to function. And we'll see that, you can see it, we're going going to go through the systems. We'll look at the integumentary system first, then we'll look at bones. When we get to muscles is the first time you can really see how cool it is that the anatomical structures at the microscopic level are giving rise to the physiological mechanism of being able to contract. It's super cool. That was when I first fell in love with A&P, was muscle contraction. But then all throughout 202, we'll be looking at physiology of the rest of the complex systems, and it's amazing. It's great. And you've got this body that does all this for you, and you can use it to study with, so it's great. So those are our two sciences that we're going through this semester, anatomy and physiology. And we'll be looking at life. And so life is organized. That's the first thing that we have to be aware of and understand. To understand our physiology is understanding the different levels of organization. And they started the study at as far as living organisms go, the smallest thing that we have are the chemical level, which are made of atoms and molecules. Anatomists and physiologists don't really study the chemical level, chemists do, but this is our lowest level of organization. So we can say our lowest or our first level of organization is the chemical level, and it's made up of atoms and molecules. This is primarily studied by chemists. Now we are going to talk about ions and how they work to give rise to physiological structures, but we don't need to worry about how those ions are formed and all of the chemistry of that, because what we're doing is we're applying that to our physiology. So that's our first level, is the chemical level. Our atoms and our molecules come together to form organelles that are going to make up our cells. So the next level of organization is the cellular level. And this contains cells that are made of organelles. We'll talk more about the cellular level on Wednesday, and as we move through each of the systems, we'll be looking at the different cells that make up our different tissues and organs. And we'll look at those cells and see what are the specialized organelles that give the cells the ability to behave in a certain way. Why is it that muscle cells can contract? What organelles do they have that are allowing them to behave in that way? Cells are, throughout the body, are interdependent on each other. They work together to really help to give function, all of these complex physiological functions, to human beings. So what we can say about human beings is that we are multicellular, and our cells are going to work together to keep the whole organism alive. And our cells are going to come together to form our next level of organization, the tissue level. So our tissue level of organization is two or more cell types working together or coming together to form this cohesive structure. When you get two or more tissue types working together, we call that the organ level of organization. And these two or more tissues in an organ are coming together to serve a function. What do they serve a function in? An organ system. So an organ system is when we have two or more organs that are working closely together to give rise to some vital life function. So the different systems that we have that we'll look at. The first one that we'll talk about is the integumentary system. This is made of the hair, the skin, the nails. All of the glands that are associated with the skin are part of that system. And the function of the integumentary system is to really, it does a lot. It helps to provide an external barrier, which is a necessary life function. Living organisms have to be able to maintain internal constancy. Our skin is going to help us do that. So it helps provide immunity. It's a physical barrier. It's got nerve receptors in it that will help us with sensation. It synthesizes vitamin D, which is really important. Vitamin D then gets converted down a couple other steps so that we can absorb calcium. So it's really a very important system. We have these glands that are going to sweat, which helps with the cooling. We also have glands that are going to release chemical messages that can be kind of unconsciously perceived by members of the same species or members of a different species. So the skin is very important. It seems like it'd be pretty boring, but it's actually a really important system. The next system we'll talk about is the skeletal system. This is comprised of the bones and ligaments and cartilage that attach our bones together. And the skeletal system is going to be really important for providing the physical structure that all of our soft tissues hang on or are protected by. So it protects our vital organs, it gives structure to the body, they provide attachment points for our muscles so that we can move. Blood cells are actually formed in the bones, and the bones are mineral storage sites. So the skeletal system is also very important. The muscular system is all of the skeletal muscles that are going to attach to bones to allow you to create movement. And this is going to help with your ability to manipulate the environment, to move, to communicate, to maintain posture. And also our skeletal muscles are always in a slight state of contraction. And what that does is allows us to produce body heat. And we need our body heat to stay within a homeostatic range so that we can maintain all of our enzymes working at the appropriate rate and things like that. So the muscular system is really important as well. The last system we'll talk about this semester is the nervous system. The nervous system is the brain, the spinal cord, and then the nerves that go out to the periphery and attach to our sensory receptors. It's really the fastest acting control system. It's not the only control system, but it's the faster acting control system. It's going to be able to respond to internal and external changes and allow organs or you to respond in different ways so that we can activate muscles, glands, etc. to bring about some change in response to that and whatever's going on in the environment. We'll start next semester with the other major controller. The endocrine system is the longer-term controller, but it works hand in hand with the nervous system to control all of your homeostatic variables. It's a fascinating system. It's one of my favorites. And this is comprised of all of the glands that secrete hormones. And our hormones, again, are controlling longer-term variables like growth, reproduction, feeding, and all of that. So that's what we'll start with next semester. We'll follow up with the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood flowing through them. And that system is going to help you to transport your respiratory gases and your nutrients from one place to another. The next system we'll talk about is the lymphatic system, which helps with immunity. The lymphatic system is a system that most people aren't even aware that you have. It's a third set of blood vessels. In addition to in your cardiovascular system, you've got veins and arteries. But running with your veins and arteries, we have these other vessels called lymphatic vessels. And they're picking up extra tissue fluid that isn't picked back up in the veins, and they return it to the blood through our lymphatic ducts. And all along the way, we have these lymph nodes, and those are sites of immune system activation. So if you step on a nail and get bacteria in your foot, we can hit a lymph node in your knee and in your inguinal region, which is your hip area, and start an immune response so that we can hopefully get an immune response activated before you get sick. Then we'll move on and talk about the respiratory system, which is all of your upper respiratory system are the structures in your head and neck. Your lower respiratory system is from your neck down. It has our lungs, primarily they're the biggest organs of the respiratory system. And this is going to be continually working to bring oxygen into the body and bring carbon dioxide out of the body. We'll also talk about the digestive system, which is this comprised of the alimentary canal or the GI tract, which is this continuous tube that runs from mouth to anus, and the accessory organs that are providing secretions so that we can intake, digest, and absorb food. We'll talk also next semester about the urinary system. This is comprised of the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. The kidneys are always filtering your blood, pulling out waste, and making urine that you can excrete from your body. This is another really amazing system, and when you look at the tiny little structures of it, it helps you to understand the function of urine production and waste removal on the whole. It's really amazing. And then we'll finish up the system, or the next semester, talking about the male and female reproductive systems. These are the glands and organs that are involved with reproduction, growth, and nurturing of offspring. So those are all of our organ systems. And all of our organ systems are going to come together and give rise to the highest level of organization that we as anatomists and physiologists study, which is the organismal level. So these are all of our organ systems functioning together to give rise to a living human being. Next thing that we should talk about, and it's going to start with this maintenance of your own internal and external environment. So for our necessary life functions, we could say that the first is to maintain stable internal and external environments. I should say stable and separate. So our skin is really going to help us do that. And then deep to our skin, we have plasma membranes that are like another physical barrier. So for this, we can say that our skin and plasma membranes are going to help us with this necessary life function. The next necessary life function is movement. And movement is caused by contractility. And what's moving? What needs to be able to move? Body parts or materials in and out of things. So for movement of body parts, we have skeletal muscles that you have voluntary control over. These are the muscles that we'll be talking about when we talk about the muscular system. But we also have movement of materials. And this is going to happen because of the contractility of our smooth muscle and our cardiac muscle. So we'll talk about those muscle tissues next semester. Other necessary life functions are that we have to be able to be responsive. And this is going to be the ability to respond to some type of stimuli. So we can say response to stimuli. Stimuli are just different variables that are changing. So if the stimulus is an increase in temperature, then we can respond by sweating. So we have to be able to be responsive, and this is carried out through our nervous system, through sensory receptors, which are going to detect our changes in stimuli. And then we are going to be able to initiate a response due to other parts of the nervous system. So the nervous system is actually going to execute our quick responses, and our endocrine system is going to execute longer-term responses. Next, living organisms need to be able to digest. So digestion is a complex process where we're breaking down our ingested food materials and then absorbing those through the small intestine to bring into the blood. So digestion is our breakdown of complex foodstuffs and absorption of the monomers that are our nutrients. Okay, next, living organisms need to be able to metabolize. So metabolism is a necessary life function. And metabolism is the sum total of all chemical events in the body. So we've got two types. What are called catabolic processes, where we break things down. So you eat a big piece of steak, you chew it up, and break it down, and you get those proteins down to amino acids. Those would be catabolic processes. And then we absorb those amino acids and use them to build up our own muscles. Those are anabolic processes. We build things up. So the next thing that living organisms need to be able to do to function is excrete waste. So excretion is another necessary life function. And this is the removal of waste materials. And we do this through urine and feces. So urine is going to pull out waste from the blood, or excrete waste that are in the blood. And feces is going to remove or excrete waste from like undigested materials, everything that you're not using from that meal you just ate. So we'll say this is the excretion of waste from our GI tract, which is the gastrointestinal tract. Our next vital life function is reproduction. And as far as reproduction goes, we could say reproduction of cells for growth and maintenance. And then reproduction of offspring for growth of the species. Or we'll say survival of the species. And our last necessary function, life function, is growth. And this is an increase in size of an organism, and then ultimately the whole organism. Survival needs. What are the things that we need to carry out all of those life functions? We need nutrients. And these are chemicals that are brought into the body through the ingestion of liquids and food. And we're going to use those for energy and cell building. For us, we get our nutrients from our diet. The different types of nutrients that we use are lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, vitamins, minerals, but we'll talk more about the details of that in next semester when we talk about the digestive system. The next thing that we have to survive is oxygen. And this is needed for cellular respiration. So in Bio 111, you should have talked about aerobic and anaerobic cellular respiration. To get the most ATP per molecule of glucose, then we need to go through aerobic respiration, where we're going to use oxygen to give us the most ATP that we can get. The other thing that we need for survival is water. We are actually mostly water. We're made up it's the most abundant chemical in the body, and so it's absolutely necessary for survival. This is where all of our chemical reactions are going to occur in some aqueous substance. So we'll say for water, we can say it's the most abundant molecule in the body, and it gives us the site for chemical reactions. It's going to help do things like give us surface tension so that our lung alveoli are inflated. So water is really, really important. It also gives us the fluid basis for our secretions and excretions. Believe it or not, another survival need is an appropriate body temperature. And that's because all of the chemical reactions that are needed for life happen way too slow on a regular basis to be of any significance for living organisms. So we have to have enzymes in our bodies that catalyze those reactions and speed them up to make them significant and allow them to happen fast enough. And if you don't have appropriate body temperature, if you're too high or you're too low, your enzymes don't function properly. So our appropriate body temperature is going to allow our enzymes to function, and enzymes are going to catalyze the chemical reactions in the body or speed them up. Then the last thing that we need for survival is atmospheric pressure. And this will be something that we talk more about next semester when we talk about the respiratory system. And what this is going to do is allow for adequate breathing. A key term that we'll see throughout this semester and next semester is homeostasis. Homeo means same, stasis means same, so homeostasis is keeping things the same. So basically what you're trying to do is maintain this stable environment despite a continually changing external environment. So for homeostasis, we'll say this is the maintenance of a stable internal environment despite a continually changing external environment. We're not going to be able to make it through all of the material that I wanted to today, so we'll pick up on Wednesday talking about the language of anatomy. So the last thing we'll talk about today are homeostatic control mechanisms. How is it that our body systems are able to maintain homeostasis in response to everything that's going on? So when we look at homeostatic control mechanisms, this is going to be how we continuously monitor and respond to external changes. So here, our mechanisms are going to continuously monitor and respond to changes. And every homeostatic control mechanism has 3 parts in the body. So there's some stimulus, which is a change in a variable, that's detected by a sensor. So we could say the first part is our receptor or our sensor. And this is going to detect a change in some stimulus or some variable. So in the example of if the stimulus is an increase in body temperature. So that's the change in variable is an increase in environmental temperature that's going to be picked up by your skin. The receptor are thermoreceptors in your skin. We've got hot and cold thermoreceptors, but they detect that change. So they're the receptor in the control system. They're going to communicate the information about that change in a variable to a control center. So the next part of the homeostatic control mechanism is a control center. And what this is going to do is it's going to integrate all of the incoming information and initiate change. So we'll say it integrates info from receptors and initiates change. In the case of our thermoregulatory mechanisms, this is part of your brain called the hypothalamus. So it's going to get information from all of your thermoreceptors that are telling it that we have had an increase in temperature, and it's going to decide what to do about it. It's going to take in all of that information from all of the receptors around your body, integrate that, and initiate our change by stimulating the last part of our homeostatic control mechanism, the effector. And the effector is going to bring about change. To continue with the example of thermoregulation, then if we're too hot, then we can turn on our sweat glands and we can dilate our blood vessels. And blood will flow to the skin, you'll increase blood flow, it's going to bring that hot blood to the surface. We turn on those sweat glands and you lose heat through evaporative cooling. So there are two types of homeostatic control mechanisms. First, negative feedback. And negative feedback does not mean bad, and it does not mean less. Negative feedback is what most of our homeostatic control mechanisms are. And negative feedback brings the body back to homeostasis. There are only a few examples of positive feedback in the body we'll look at in just a second. So it's just like a generalized schematic of negative feedback. We have some stimulus that's going to produce some change in our variable, and that's going to be detected by our receptor. The receptor is going to communicate that information to our control center. So afferent pathways are going to, I think of afferent as like approaching. They approach the control center and bring it the information, and then the change is going to be brought out through this output, it exits the control center through an efferent pathway, and is going to stimulate our effector. Our effector brings about our change so that we come back to balance. So our effector is going to carry out the response, and we come back to homeostasis. So the example of if when you're hot and cold, you come out of balance, you get too hot, these sensors in your skin are going to detect it and communicate that to our hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to then activate our sweat glands, we'll have evaporation, and that's going to drop our body temperature to restore homeostasis. It works the opposite way also. If it gets too cold, cold receptors in your skin are going to detect that. They're going to let the hypothalamus know. What it's going to do is it's going to turn off your sweat glands, and it's going to make you shiver. If we contract our skeletal muscles and shiver, then all of that extra work that you're doing, that production of all of the ATP required to contract those skeletal muscles, is going to produce heat. So that should bring us back up to homeostasis. So negative feedback works both ways. It always brings you back to homeostasis. Positive feedback moves you away from homeostasis. There are only a few examples of positive feedback in the body. Blood clotting, and then every other example happens in the female reproductive system. Ovulation, or the first half of the ovarian cycle, parturition, which is delivery of a baby. So this is, let's say, labor and delivery, and then lactation. These are the only examples of positive feedback in the body. And what happens in positive feedback is you have more of something that results in the production of more of something that results in the production of more of something. So you're moving away from homeostasis. In the example of a blood clot, if we have a break in a blood vessel wall, we have to stop that right away. We've got to clot that up. So what's going to happen is our platelets are going to be released, they're going to stick to the collagen fibers in that broken vessel, and they're going to start releasing chemicals that call more platelets to the area. So more platelets get to the area, and they release more chemicals that call more platelets that release more chemicals, so that we can form a clot and plug that off so that we don't lose blood. In the example of like labor and delivery. A baby pushes on a mom's cervix. That stimulates the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes uterine contraction, so the baby pushes on a mom's cervix, which causes the hypothalamus to release more oxytocin. So more oxytocin results in more contraction, results in more oxytocin, results in more contraction. So it's moving you away from homeostasis. And this feedback loop will stop when the external factor has stopped. So when you've plugged this blood vessel up, when the baby's removed from the body, when the woman stops nursing and lactating. But we'll talk all about the rest of those. Actually, we talk about all of these next semester. So when we talk about feedback mechanisms this semester, they're all going to be negative feedback mechanisms that are moving us back toward homeostasis. All right, so as far as the homeostatic imbalance goes, really all we have to say about this is when we're outside of homeostatic balance, then this will increase our risk of disease and homeostatic imbalances contribute mostly to aging. So that's really all I have to say about that, is when you're outside of homeostasis for too long, it can increase your risk of disease, and also homeostatic imbalances result in aging. So a homeostatic imbalance is being outside of homeostasis, and what does this do? It increases risk of disease, and it causes aging.